Hi, welcome to the Aftermath Tales. Ready for a new story? Very well, let's begin.
You know what they say about karma? Well, I'm living proof that sometimes she takes her sweet time, but when she finally shows up, she comes with interest. My name is Jane Lester Scott now, though for most of my adult life I was Jane Lester, my maiden name that I reclaimed after my divorce. Before that, I was Jane Swanson for 11 miserable years, but we'll get to that disaster later. Right now, let me tell you about the good part. Let me paint you a picture of my former life, because honestly, it reads like a cautionary tale about marrying your college sweetheart before you know who you really are. Frank Swanson was charming once. Hard to believe now, I know. We got married young, and for a while things were good. Then I made the mistake of getting comfortable. You know how it goes. Marriage, mortgage, and then, according to Frank, I committed the cardinal sin of prioritizing our home over my appearance. "Jane, you've really let yourself go," Frank would say, standing in our kitchen doorway like some disappointed food critic. "Look at yourself. When's the last time you even put on makeup?" I was 8 months pregnant at the time, with his child, our daughter. The criticism became a daily soundtrack. I stopped working at his insistence after Violet was born because he wanted a proper wife at home. What he really wanted was control, but I was too naive to see it then. "I wanted a son," Frank announced when the nurse handed him our beautiful baby girl. Not, "She's perfect," or "I love her," or even "She has your eyes." Just disappointment, served cold in a hospital room that should have been filled with joy. Violet grew up trying to win her father's love the way some people chase mirages in the desert, desperately and hopelessly. She'd draw him pictures, show him her little designs, anything to get a smile or a pat on the head. "Daddy, look what I made," Violet would say, holding up another one of her intricate drawings. She was maybe 7 then, and already showing incredible talent. "That's nice, Violet," Frank would mumble without looking up from his newspaper. "But maybe you should focus on something more practical. Art is a waste of time." I watched my daughter's face fall every single time, and something inside me broke a little more each day. Then came that Tuesday in March, the day my old life ended and my real life began. I came home from grocery shopping to find our belongings in trash bags on the front lawn. Actual trash bags, like we were garbage to be collected. Destiny Clarkin was standing in my kitchen, wearing my apron, stirring something in my pot. "Oh good, you're here," she said with that saccharine smile of hers. "Frank wanted me to tell you that you and the kid need to be gone by tonight. I'm moving in." I stood there, groceries still in my hands, trying to process the magnitude of betrayal. Not just Frank's betrayal, but the sheer audacity of this woman who'd been his secretary for all of 6 months. "Where's Frank?" I managed to ask. "Work," Destiny shrugged. "He said he couldn't deal with the drama." Couldn't deal with the drama. Of destroying his family, of abandoning his daughter, of throwing away 11 years of marriage like it meant nothing. Within hours, we were homeless. Frank had cleaned out our joint bank account, leaving me with exactly $43 in my purse. No family to call. My parents had died in a car accident 5 years earlier, and Frank had systematically isolated me from old friends. No job to return to because he'd made me quit. No savings because every penny had gone to his precious image. That first night, Violet and I slept in our old sedan in a Walmart parking lot. I kept the engine running for heat and watched my 10-year-old daughter try to make herself comfortable in the back seat, using her school backpack as a pillow. "Mommy, why can't we go home?" she asked, her voice small in the darkness. "Because sometimes grown-ups make very bad choices, sweetheart," I said, fighting back tears. "But we're going to be okay. I promise." The next morning, I drove Violet to school like nothing had happened. I couldn't let her miss school, couldn't let her fall behind because of Frank's cruelty. I waited in the car until she disappeared into the building. Then I cried until there were no tears left. When Violet came out of school that afternoon, she looked upset. "Mommy, Andy wants to know if she can come over today to work on our science project," she said quietly. Andy Smith was Violet's best friend since kindergarten, and I'd become close with her parents, Dan and Sylvia, over the years. They were good people, salt of the earth types who ran a small garment factory and treated everyone like family. "Baby, we can't have friends over right now," I said carefully. "Is it because we don't have a house anymore?" Violet asked, climbing into the car. My heart broke. "What did you tell Andy?" "The truth," Violet said simply. "That Daddy kicked us out and we're living in the car now." An hour later, my phone rang. Sylvia Smith. "Jane, where are you right now?" she said before I could even say hello. "Andy told us what happened, and I am beyond furious. How dare he throw you out like that?" "Sylvia, no, listen to me. Where are you staying? Do you have somewhere safe to go?" I looked around the Walmart parking lot where we were sitting, Violet doing homework in the back seat while I pretended to read a magazine. We're in the Walmart parking lot on 5th Street, I admitted, my voice breaking. "We don't have anywhere to go. We don't have any money. Frank took everything." The line went quiet for a moment, then I heard Sylvia's muffled voice calling, "Dan, get the truck, now!" "Jane, honey, you listen to me," Sylvia said, her voice fierce with protective anger. "You stay right where you are. We're coming to get you right now. Family takes care of family, and you've been family to us for years. Sylvia, you don't understand how bad this is." "Then it's a good thing you have us," she said firmly. "Dan's loading the truck now. We'll be there in 20 minutes. Just follow us when we get there." Within an hour, Dan and Sylvia Smith had found us in that parking lot. We loaded our few belongings from our car into their truck bed, and then I followed them in my sedan to a small apartment above their factory that they'd been planning to rent out. "You'll stay here as long as you need," Sylvia said, her voice fierce with maternal protection as we carried our things upstairs. "Rent-free. We've got plenty of food, and this place comes furnished." "I can't let you," I started. "You can, and you will," Dan interrupted. "Frank Swanson is a fool, and we don't let good people suffer because of fools, not on our watch." That night, as Violet and I sat on the borrowed couch in our new temporary home, she looked at me with those big brown eyes and said, "Mommy, are we going to be okay?" I pulled her close and made her a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. "Baby, we're going to be better than okay. We're going to be extraordinary." I had no idea how right I would turn out to be. 6 months after Frank threw us away like yesterday's newspaper, I was sitting in the waiting area of Scott & Associates Financial Services, wearing my one good interview suit and praying my hands would stop shaking. The classified ad had been simple: accountant needed, experience required, competitive salary. I'd sent out 47 resumes in 3 months. 46 companies had the courtesy to send rejection letters. Scott & Associates was the only one that called. "Jane Lester?" A deep voice called from across the reception area. I looked up to see a tall man in his 30s with kind eyes and an expensive suit. He looked like he belonged on the cover of Business Weekly, not interviewing desperate single mothers in small accounting firms. "That's me," I said, standing up and hoping my voice sounded more confident than I felt. "Andrew Scott," he said, extending his hand with a warm smile. "I'll be conducting your interview today. My HR manager is at a conference, so you're stuck with the boss." He led me to his office, and I immediately understood why this man was successful. The space was immaculate but warm, with family photos on his desk and books that looked actually read rather than decorative. "So, Jane," Andrew said, settling into his chair, "tell me about your background." I gave him the sanitized version. College degree in accounting, several years of experience before I took time off to raise my daughter, recent return to the workforce. I didn't mention that my time off was forced by a controlling husband, or that my recent return was because said husband had literally thrown us out. "And why do you want to work for Scott & Associates?" Andrew asked. Here's where I could have given the standard interview answer about growth opportunities and company values. Instead, I looked at this man who was giving me a chance when no one else would, and I told him the truth. "Because you're the only person who called me back," I said. "Because I have a 10-year-old daughter who needs to see that hard work pays off, and because I'm really, really good with numbers. I just need someone to give me a chance to prove it." Andrew leaned back in his chair and studied me for a moment. Then he smiled, not the polite interview smile, but a real one. "When can you start?" he asked. "Tomorrow?" I said, probably too eagerly. Perfect. We'll start you at $55,000 with full benefits and flexible hours for any school events you need to attend. I nearly fell out of my chair. It was more money than Frank had made as an area manager. 2 weeks after I started working, I was finally able to approach Dan and Sylvia with the conversation I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. I could pay them rent now, but I knew they will not accept my money. I found a small apartment across town. I told them over dinner at their kitchen table. It's nothing fancy, but it's ours and I can afford it now. Sylvia's face immediately fell. Jane, you don't have to rush out. You're welcome here as long as you want. I know, I said, my voice thick with gratitude, and I can never repay you for what you've done for us. But you've been planning to rent this place out, and I don't want to keep you from that income any longer. You've already done more than enough. Dan cleared his throat roughly. That apartment can wait. You and Violet are family. Which is exactly why I need to do this, I said firmly. You saved us when we had nothing. Now I have a job and I can stand on my own feet. That's what you taught me was possible. 3 weeks into the job, I was staying late to finish quarterly reports when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Heard you're working now. Don't think this changes anything. You're still nothing without Frank. Freaking destiny. Even after taking everything from me, she couldn't leave me alone. I just blocked her number. Andrew appeared at my cubicle with 2 cups of coffee. Working late again? Just finishing up the Morrison account, I said, quickly putting my phone face down. Everything all right? You look upset? For a moment, I considered lying, but Andrew had shown me nothing but kindness and respect, something I'd forgotten existed. Just some unpleasant reminders from my past, I said carefully. Andrew set the coffee on my desk and leaned against the cubicle wall. Want to talk about it? Not really, I admitted. But thank you for asking. Most people don't. Most people are idiots, Andrew said matter-of-factly. Take it from someone who employs a lot of them. I laughed, actually laughed for the first time in months. There it is, Andrew said with satisfaction. You have a beautiful smile, Jane. You should use it more often. 6 months later, Andrew asked me to dinner. Not for business, for us. I know this might be complicated, he said, standing nervously by my desk after everyone else had gone home. The boss asking out an employee isn't exactly standard protocol, but I can't stop thinking about you, and I was hoping you might feel the same way. I looked at this man who had given me back dignity, my financial independence, and my self-worth, who had never once made me feel small or inadequate, who asked about Violet's school projects and remembered her birthday. Yes, I said, I'd like that very much. On our 3rd date, I brought Violet to meet him at a family restaurant. I was terrified. What if he was just being polite about my daughter? What if seeing the reality of single motherhood scared him off? You must be Violet, Andrew said, standing up from our booth with that same warm smile. Your mom talks about you all the time. She tells me you're quite the artist. Violet, shy at first, warmed up to him immediately. By the end of dinner, she was showing him sketches on her napkin and chattering about her dreams of designing clothes. You know, Andrew said seriously, studying her drawings, I think you have real talent. Have you ever thought about taking art classes? Mommy says they're too expensive, Violet said, glancing at me apologetically. Well, Andrew said, winking at me, maybe we can work something out. A year later, Andrew asked us to move in with him. Not just me, us. He'd already converted one of his spare bedrooms into an art studio for Violet, complete with professional drawing tables, high-end supplies, and the best lighting money could buy. Andrew, this is too much, I protested, standing in the doorway of what looked like a professional design studio. It's not nearly enough, he said, watching 12-year-old Violet explore her new space with wonder. She has a gift, Jane. She should have the tools to develop it. That night, as we were unpacking Violet's things in her new room, which was bigger than our entire apartment, she looked up at me with tears in her eyes. Mommy, is Andrew going to be my new daddy? What do you think about that? I asked carefully. I think, Violet said, considering her words, that he's more like a daddy to me than Frank ever was. Frank never cared about my drawings. Andrew bought me a whole room for them. You can call him whatever feels right to you, sweetheart. The next morning, Violet bounced into the kitchen where Andrew was making pancakes. Actual pancakes from scratch in shapes of butterflies and flowers. "Good morning, Dad," she said casually, like she'd been saying it her whole life. Andrew's spatula clattered to the floor. When he turned around, his eyes were filled with tears of pure joy. "Good morning, sweetheart," he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. He knelt down to her 12-year-old height and wrapped her in the biggest hug I'd ever seen, both of them crying happy tears. I watched this beautiful man, who had never asked for a ready-made family but had embraced us anyway, hold my daughter like she was the most precious thing in the world. And I knew that sometimes when life takes everything away from you, it's just making room for something infinitely better. Destiny could keep her stolen life with Frank. I had found something real. 9 years later, Violet was home from design school for summer break, and our house had become a showcase for her incredible talent. Every wall displayed her latest creations, streetwear that was both edgy and elegant, practical yet artistic. She'd inherited my eye for detail and thankfully nothing from Frank except perhaps her stubborn determination to succeed. "Mom, Dad," Violet called from her studio one afternoon. "Andy's here." Andrew and I exchanged amused glances. Even after all these years, hearing Violet call him Dad still made Andrew's face light up like Christmas morning. And watching her with Andy always reminded me how friendship could be just as powerful as family, sometimes more so. Andy Smith had grown up alongside Violet, and they were more like sisters than friends. She was studying business at the same college as Violet, and together they made a formidable team. Andy had inherited her parents' practical wisdom and work ethic, while Violet had the creative vision that could change the world. "Come see what Violet's been working on this semester," Andy called out as we entered the studio. Violet was standing beside her drafting table, practically vibrating with excitement, holding up a collection of sketches that took my breath away. "Violet, these are incredible," I said, studying the designs. They were street clothes, but elevated. Hoodies with architectural lines, jeans with subtle artistic details, jackets that look like wearable art. "She's been working on these all semester," Andy said, beaming with pride for her best friend. "Violet, show them the color story you developed." As Violet spread out her color palettes and fabric samples, I could see Andrew's business mind starting to engage. He had that look he got when he spotted a profitable opportunity. "These aren't just designs," Andrew said slowly, examining the sketches with growing excitement. "These are products. Violet, have you thought about actually producing these?" "Well," Violet said, glancing at Andy nervously, "we've actually been talking about that." "We've been researching the market," Andy added quickly. "Streetwear is huge right now, but most of it's either cheap fast fashion or ridiculously expensive designer stuff. There's a gap in the market for quality, artistic streetwear at accessible prices." Andrew leaned forward and I could see the wheels turning. "Tell me more." "We even have a name," Violet said, gaining confidence. "Viandi Street, Violet and Andy, combining our names since we're going to build this together." I felt tears prick my eyes. After everything we'd been through, after all the times Frank had dismissed Violet's dreams as worthless, here she was turning them into something real. "The problem is production," Andy continued. "We'd need a manufacturer, startup capital, marketing." "What about your parents' factory?" Andrew asked. "They're still running the garment business, right?" Andy's face fell slightly. "Yes, but they're struggling. Have been for a couple of years now. Orders have dried up, and they're barely keeping the doors open. We can't ask them to take on a risky new project when they're already in trouble." Andrew stood up and started pacing, something he did when his mind was racing through possibilities. "Andy," he said suddenly, "call your parents. Ask them if they can come over for dinner tomorrow night." "What? Why?" Andy asked. "Because," Andrew said with a grin that I recognized as his "I'm about to change everyone's life" expression, "I think it's time we had a family meeting about the future of fashion." The next evening, Dan and Sylvia Smith sat in our dining room looking nervous and confused. Andrew had insisted on cooking his famous lasagna that he only made for special occasions. So, Dan said carefully, Andy said you wanted to discuss some kind of business proposition? That's right, Andrew said, setting down his fork and looking serious. But first, I want you to know how grateful Jane and I are for everything you've done for our family. You saved them when they had nothing, and we've never forgotten that. Andrew, Sylvia said softly, you don't need to. Yes, I do, Andrew interrupted gently. Because what I'm about to propose isn't charity, it's business. Smart business. He nodded to Violet and Andy, who had been nervously fidgeting through dinner. Girls, show them what you've been working on. For the next hour, Violet and Andy presented their business plan with the passion and precision of seasoned entrepreneurs. They had market research, cost projections, competitor analysis, and a vision that was both ambitious and achievable. When they finished, the room was silent. Dan was staring at the sketches with wonder. Sylvia was crying quietly. These designs, Dan said finally, are extraordinary. Violet, you have incredible talent. The business plan is solid too, Sylvia added, wiping her eyes. Andy, you've thought of everything. Here's what I'm proposing, Andrew said, leaning forward. I'll provide the startup capital, $50,000 to begin with. Dan, your factory handles production. Sylvia, we'd love to have you manage operations. The girls split ownership 50-50, and your family gets a percentage of profits plus steady manufacturing contracts. Andrew, Dan said, his voice rough with emotion, that's incredibly generous, but we can't let you risk. Risk? Andrew laughed. Dan, I've been in business for 20 years. I know a winning investment when I see one. These girls are going to be huge. 6 months later, we were staring at Violet's laptop screen in complete disbelief. Play it again, I said weakly. Violet clicked replay on the TikTok video. Dawn Jeffrey, the most popular fashion influencer in the South with over 2 million followers, was doing a Get Ready With Me video wearing Violet's designs. Okay, y'all, I am obsessed with this new brand I found, Dawn was saying, spinning in Violet's jacket. It's called Viandi Street, and this jacket is literally everything. It's comfortable enough for every day, but cool enough that I feel like a fashion icon. And don't get me started on these jeans. They make my butt look incredible. The video had 8 million views and was still climbing. Violet's phone had been ringing non-stop for 3 days. 3 months after Dawn Jeffrey's video went viral, I was at Violet and Andy's office when my phone rang. It was Dan, and he sounded like he was having a nervous breakdown. Jane, you need to get over here right now. Dan's voice was high-pitched with panic. Violet and Andy just sent us the production orders for next month, and I think I'm going to faint. 20 minutes later, I was standing in Dan and Sylvia's factory office, watching the most beautiful chaos I'd ever seen unfold. Jane, Sylvia shrieked, running toward me with a stack of production orders clutched to her chest like precious artifacts. We have a problem, a wonderful, terrible problem. What's wrong? I asked, though her face was glowing with the kind of panic that looked suspiciously like joy. Look at these orders from the girl's office, she gasped, spreading the papers on her desk. Target ordered 50,000 units. Macy's wants 30,000. Nordstrom, Urban Outfitters, and Zara. We can't make this many clothes. We don't have enough machines. We don't have enough people. We don't have enough anything. Dan burst through the office door, his hair standing on end like he'd been electrocuted. Sylvia, did you tell her about the international orders yet? International? I squeaked. Violet called this morning, Dan said, looking like he might faint. They've hired remote employees across Europe and Asia to handle customer service and international orders in their local time zones. H&M wants to distribute Viandi's all their European stores. That's thousands of locations, Jane. And some company from Tokyo wants exclusive distribution rights for Asia. The production orders from Violet and Andy's office are so big I can't even count the zeros. Sylvia started fanning herself with the production orders. We need 50 more sewing machines, 100 more employees, trucks. We need trucks, Dan, big ones. And what about fabric? Where are we going to store all this fabric? And where are we going to put the finished clothes? Dan added, gesturing wildly. Our warehouse is the size of a matchbox compared to what the girls are asking us to produce. Just then, Andrew walked in, took one look at the beautifully panicked couple and burst out laughing. Let me guess, he said, grinning at their matching expressions of terrified bliss. Success is scarier than failure? Andrew! Sylvia grabbed his arm. We're going to need a miracle, multiple miracles, industrial-sized miracles. Funny you should mention that, Andrew said, pulling out his phone. I just bought the building next door, the one with the massive warehouse, and the one behind that too, just in case. Dan's mouth fell open. You what? I also took the liberty of ordering 100 new sewing machines and posting job listings for 200 seamstresses, pattern makers, and quality control specialists, Andrew continued casually. Oh, and I bought 3 delivery trucks. Sylvia sat down heavily in her chair, fanning herself more vigorously. I think I'm having a heart attack, a happy heart attack, but still a heart attack. Breathe, honey, Dan said, though he looked equally overwhelmed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, we're rich and successful and completely terrified. This is the best worst thing that's ever happened to us, Sylvia declared, tears streaming down her face. I don't know whether to laugh or cry or throw up from excitement. Why not all 3? Andrew suggested helpfully. 6 months later, we stood in the sprawling Viandi Street corporate campus that now took up an entire city block, watching Violet and Andy cut the ribbon on their brand new headquarters, while news crews filmed and fashion journalists took notes. You know, Sylvia said, wiping happy tears from her eyes as she watched trucks loaded with Viandi Street shipments heading to 3 different continents. I never thought I'd say this, but panic looks good on us. Meanwhile, Dan was in his element at the expanded factory, wearing a hard hat and carrying a clipboard like he'd been born to manage international manufacturing, directing the installation of their 100th new sewing machine. A year later, we stood in the grand ballroom of Atlanta's most exclusive hotel, watching Violet and Andy being interviewed by fashion journalists about their meteoric rise to becoming one of the Southeast's most successful fashion brands, and quite possibly the happiest panicking manufacturing operation in the world. You know what the best part is? Sylvia said, standing next to me as we watched Violet and Andy being interviewed by fashion journalists. What's that? Frank has no idea any of this is happening. He threw away a future fashion mogul because he wanted a son instead of a daughter. I looked at my brilliant, successful, happy daughter, who now employed hundreds of people and had been featured in Vogue, and smiled. His loss, I said simply. Our gain. 2 years later, Andrew proposed to me on the same spot where we'd first met, his office, now relocated to the penthouse of our building. And as I said yes to spending forever with the man who had given Violet and me everything Frank never could, I realized that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well. Very, very well. Frank Swanson straightened his tie for the 3rd time and checked his reflection in the hotel mirror. The annual Stanford Manufacturing Company dinner was always held at nice venues, but the Ritz-Carlton was definitely a step up from previous years. Maybe his boss was finally recognizing his value as area manager. You look fine, Frank, Destiny said, applying another coat of lipstick. It's just a company dinner, not the Met Gala. I want to make a good impression, Frank replied, though he wasn't sure why he was so nervous. Mr. Richardson doesn't usually spring for places this fancy. They made their way down to the Magnolia Ballroom, where Frank's colleagues were already mingling around cocktail tables. The atmosphere was more relaxed than usual, probably because Richardson had booked everyone rooms for the night so they could actually enjoy themselves. Attention, everyone, Mr. Richardson called out, tapping his champagne glass. I hope you're all having a wonderful evening. Unfortunately, I'll have to leave you shortly. I'm attending a wedding reception next door for my good friend Andrew Scott. He owns Scott and Associates Financial, one of the most successful firms in the state. Brilliant man, brilliant business. Just got married today. Frank felt a strange chill run down his spine. Andrew Scott. That name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. Please enjoy the rest of your evening, Richardson continued. The bar stays open until midnight. And remember, your rooms are all paid for, so have fun. As Richardson left, Frank noticed Destiny's eyes had lit up with curiosity. Did you hear that? She whispered excitedly. There's a rich people's wedding reception next door. I want to see what that looks like. Destiny, We can't just crash someone's wedding reception, Frank protested, but she was already heading toward the door. We're not crashing it, we're just observing, she said, pulling him along. Come on, don't be such a stick in the mud. When will we ever get another chance to see how the other half lives? Against his better judgment, Frank found himself following his wife out of the Magnolia Ballroom and toward the sounds of music and laughter coming from the grand ballroom next door. They lingered near the entrance, watching as elegantly dressed servers moved in and out with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. When a large group of late arrivals approached the doors, Frank and Destiny simply fell in step behind them, blending into the crowd as they entered the ballroom. The scene that greeted them was unlike anything Frank had ever witnessed. The ballroom was transformed into something out of a fairy tale, with crystal chandeliers, elaborate floral arrangements, and what had to be a 5-tier wedding cake. But it wasn't the decorations that made Frank's jaw drop, it was the guest list. Oh my God, Destiny breathed, clutching his arm. Is that the actress from that new Netflix series? Frank barely heard her. His eyes were scanning the room, taking in faces he recognized from business magazines and entertainment news. These weren't just wealthy people. These were Georgia's elite Hollywood celebrities. And was that Dawn Jeffrey? That's Dawn Jeffrey. Destiny squealed under her breath. The influencer. I follow her on everything. What is she doing here? Frank watched as the famous social media star moved through the crowd, not as a guest, but as someone clearly working the event in a professional capacity. They found a spot near a pillar where they could observe without drawing attention. Frank spotted his boss, Mr. Richardson, deep in animated conversation with a distinguished-looking man in an expensive tuxedo. Then he heard Richardson laugh loudly. Andrew, you've outdone yourself with this wedding reception. Jane looked absolutely radiant walking down the aisle today. Andrew Scott. Frank's mind raced, trying to remember where he'd heard that name before and why it made his stomach twist with unease. And how's Violet doing? Richardson continued. I saw her on the cover of Forbes last month. 25 years old and running an international fashion empire. Remarkable. Frank felt the blood drain from his face. Violet. There was only one Violet he'd ever known. She's incredible, Andrew replied proudly. I couldn't be more proud of her. She and Andy have built something extraordinary. Frank, Destiny hissed, look at that woman talking to Dawn Jeffrey. She's gorgeous and young and, oh my God, look at that dress! That has to be designer. Frank turned to look where Destiny was pointing and his world tilted on its axis. The young woman was tall, elegant, with dark hair styled in an elaborate updo. She was laughing at something Dawn Jeffrey was saying, completely at ease among the celebrities and business moguls surrounding her. Violet, someone called out, and the young woman turned. Frank's knees nearly buckled. It was her. It was unmistakably her. The little girl who used to show him her drawings, who he'd dismissed as a waste of time, who he'd abandoned 17 years ago. But this wasn't the sad, rejected child he remembered. This was a confident, successful woman who moved through this crowd of power players like she belonged there. Aren't those the two who own that successful clothing brand? One of the servers whispered to another as they passed by with champagne trays. Viandi Street. The other server replied, yeah, that's Violet and Andy. They're the co-CEOs. Started the company in college and now it's worth millions. Both of them are on the 30 under 30 list. Frank felt like he was going to be sick. Destiny was staring at him with wide eyes, clearly putting the pieces together. Frank, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the music. That's your daughter, isn't it? He couldn't speak. He could only watch as Violet, his daughter, the child he'd rejected, moved through the party like the successful businesswoman she'd become. Then, stepping up to the microphone near the head table, Violet tapped it gently to get everyone's attention. The crowd gradually fell silent. Thank you all for being here to celebrate Mom and Dad's wedding, she began, her voice carrying clearly across the ballroom. Frank felt his knees go weak. Dad. She was calling Andrew Dad. Violet's voice carried across the ballroom as she continued her toast. I want to thank my mother Jane and my dad Andrew for everything they've given me. Mom, you've been my rock through everything. And Dad, her voice caught with emotion as she looked at Andrew. You're the father who stepped up when my biological father threw Mom and me away. You believed in my dreams when he told me art was worthless. You supported every crazy idea I had, gave me the tools to succeed, and loved me like I was your own from day one." The crowd awed appreciatively, but Frank could barely hear them over the roaring in his ears. "I love you both with my whole heart," Violet finished, tears streaming down her face as she wrapped her arms around both Jane and Andrew. "Here's to many more years of happiness." Frank felt like he was drowning. Every word was a knife twist. Every smile from his daughter directed at another man was a reminder of what he'd lost. And there, radiant in her wedding gown, was Jane, his ex-wife, the woman he'd thrown away for Destiny. She looked more beautiful and confident than he'd ever seen her, glowing with happiness as she stood beside Andrew in his wedding tuxedo. Without a word, Frank grabbed Destiny's arm and pulled her toward the exit, her protests falling on deaf ears as he dragged her through the crowd and out the doors. Back in their hotel room, Frank sat heavily on the bed while Destiny paced excitedly in front of him. "Frank, this is incredible," she gushed, seemingly oblivious to his distress. "Your daughter is rich, like really rich. Did you hear what those servers said? Millions, Frank, and she's only 25. "Destiny, stop," Frank said quietly, but she was on a roll now, her eyes bright with greed and possibility. "This is perfect. She's your daughter, Frank. Your flesh and blood. She owes you something, doesn't she? I mean, you're her father. She should be sharing that wealth with us. It's only right." Frank looked up at his wife, really looked at her, and felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Share her wealth with us?" "Yes," Destiny said, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. "We could have that life, Frank. The parties, the celebrities, the designer clothes. All we have to do is reach out to her. Family is family, right?" Frank stared at Destiny, finally seeing her for what she truly was. "You want to approach the daughter I abandoned 17 years ago and ask for money?" "Why not? You're her father." "I threw her out when she was 10 years old, Destiny. I put her belongings in trash bags. I left her and her mother homeless." "But that's in the past, is it?" Frank stood up, something dangerous building in his chest. "Because I just watched my daughter call another man Dad. I watched her thank him for stepping up when I threw them away. I watched her dismiss me as just her biological father." Destiny waved her hand dismissively. "She'll get over it when she sees we need help. Blood is thicker than water." Frank felt 17 years of buried guilt and regret crash over him like a wave. His daughter, his brilliant, successful daughter, had built an empire despite him, not because of him. And here was Destiny, the woman he'd chosen over his family, wanting to profit from the success of the child she'd helped him abandon. "We're not approaching her," Frank said quietly. "But Frank, we're not approaching her," he shouted, his voice echoing off the hotel room walls. "Do you understand what we just witnessed? My boss is at that party, Destiny. My boss respects Andrew more than he respects me. If he finds out what kind of father I was, I'll lose my job." Destiny's face faltered for the first time. "You're overreacting." "Am I? Because I just realized that I threw away a future millionaire for you. I chose a secretary who can't even keep house over a wife and daughter who are now living like royalty." The words hung in the air between them, and for the first time, Frank truly understood the magnitude of his mistakes. But Destiny wasn't done. "Well, tomorrow at breakfast, I'm going to talk to her. She needs to know her father is here." Frank felt dread settle in his stomach, but he was too emotionally drained to fight anymore. He had no idea how much worse things were about to get. The next morning, Frank and Destiny made their way down to the hotel's breakfast buffet, courtesy of Stanford Manufacturing's company package. Frank had barely slept, his mind replaying every moment from the wedding reception, every word of Violet's speech echoing in his head. The breakfast room was elegant, all marble floors and crystal chandeliers, with servers attending to an elaborate spread that probably cost more than Frank spent on groceries in a month. He grabbed a plate with little appetite, his eyes automatically scanning the room out of habit. He saw his boss, Mr. Richardson, and some of his co-workers enjoying their food. And there they were. At a large corner table sat the wedding party from the night before, but they looked different in the morning light, rested, radiant, and unmistakably wealthy. Jane was glowing in an expensive designer outfit, her hair perfectly styled even for a casual breakfast. Andrew looked every inch the successful CEO in his tailored casual wear. But it was the others that made Frank's stomach twist with a different kind of recognition. Dan and Sylvia Smith sat at the table like they belonged there, dressed in clothes that screamed money. Sylvia in what was clearly a designer dress, Dan in a crisp button-down shirt, obviously expensive. They were laughing at something Andy was saying, their faces relaxed and confident. These were the same people Frank had once looked down on. The struggling garment manufacturers he'd dismissed as beneath him. The family he'd told Jane not to get too close to because we don't want to be associated with people like that. Now they sat among George's elite like they'd been born to it, while Frank was still the same middle management nobody he'd been 17 years ago. Oh my God. Destiny breathed beside him, her eyes fixed on the group. There they are. Frank, this is perfect. We can just go over and... Destiny, no, Frank whispered urgently, but she was already moving. Before he could stop her, Destiny had crossed the room and was standing beside their table, her brightest smile plastered on her face. I was having the most perfect morning of my life, surrounded by everyone I loved most, celebrating the beginning of my new marriage to Andrew. Violet was glowing as she told us about the fashion journalists who'd interviewed her last night. Dan and Sylvia were excitedly planning their next factory expansion, still in their beautiful state of successful panic. Andy was already sketching new designs on her napkin. Mom, did you see that reporter's face when I told her we started in our college dorm? Violet laughed, her eyes sparkling. You should have seen yours when she asked about international expansion, Andrew chuckled. Well, when Dan starts hyperventilating about orders from 6 continents, it's hard not to get excited, Andy teased. This was my family. Not the one I was born into, not the one Frank destroyed, but the one we chose and built together. Every face around this table represented love, loyalty, and success we'd earned together. Then we heard a loud voice. Violet! Sweetheart, I'm Destiny, and your real father is right over there. Now everyone in the restaurant was looking, and the joyful conversation died instantly. My blood turned to ice as I looked up at the woman who destroyed my first marriage, standing beside my daughter with that same smug smile from 17 years ago. Get away from us, I said firmly. Leave us alone. Now, Jane, Destiny purred with fake sweetness. Is that any way to talk to family? You certainly look like you've done well for yourself. Finally learned how to take care of your appearance, I see. But I wasn't the broken, abandoned woman she remembered. I was surrounded by people who loved me, and I had found my strength. Andrew looked confused. I'm sorry, who are you exactly? Oh, that's Destiny Clarkin, Sylvia said with delicious satisfaction. The mistress, the one who was spreading her legs in Jane's bed while Jane was grocery shopping, she said loudly. I had to suppress a smile at Sylvia's perfectly timed verbal assassination, and witnessing Destiny's facial reaction, Andrew immediately stood up, his protective instincts kicking in. But then Destiny made her fatal mistake. Look, all I'm saying is that Violet has a responsibility to her father. It's only right that she shares some of her fortune with Frank. Blood is blood, she screamed. Then we erupted in laughter. I watched my daughter stand up with the grace and confidence of the CEO she'd become. Right to share my fortune with Frank? Violet's voice carried clearly across the restaurant. Everybody, listen up. Here is the woman my former father cheated with, and together they kicked my mother and me out of our house when I was 10 years old. Here is my biological father, who made sure we ended up homeless and broke, living in our car. So tell me, everyone, should I share my hard-earned money with these two? Oh, hell no, came the immediate response from multiple tables. Never! The audacity! I had never been more proud of my daughter. This was the little girl who used to cry when Frank ignored her drawings, now commanding a room full of George's elite. Andrew stepped closer to Destiny, his voice dangerous. If you don't leave my family alone right now, I will personally ensure that your belongings end up in trash bags on someone's porch. Sound familiar? I am so sorry, Andrew said, turning to address the restaurant. This will not continue. But then, cutting through the noise, came a voice that made Frank's knees buckle. "Frank!" Mr. Richardson's voice boomed across the restaurant. Frank's boss was standing now, his face thunderous. "I want to see you in my office first thing tomorrow morning." The blood drained from Frank's face as he realized that his boss, the man who controlled his livelihood, now knew exactly what kind of man he really was. And as Destiny finally began to understand the magnitude of their humiliation, Frank realized that his nightmare was far from over. "I'm so sorry about that," I said to our table. "I never wanted our past to intrude on our happiness." "Jane," Andrew said firmly, "that is not your fault. You have nothing to apologize for." Dan and Sylvia burst into laughter. "Are you kidding? That was better than cable TV? Did you see her face when I called her a mistress?" Sylvia cackled. Andy hugged Violet. "That speech was incredible. I'm so proud of you." Looking around at these beautiful people, my husband, my daughter, and the family that chose us when we had nothing, I realized that sometimes the best revenge really is living well. The moment they reached the parking lot, Frank's rage exploded. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he roared, his voice echoing off the concrete. Destiny stumbled backward, shocked. Frank had never yelled at her before. "You couldn't keep your filthy mouth shut for 5 minutes? You couldn't just leave them alone?" "But Frank, she's rich now," Destiny tried to explain. "What you just did will cost me my job." "My boss just watched you embarrass me in front of the entire restaurant. You just ruined whatever reputation I had left." I was just trying to help. "I am so over this. I'm over your greed, your stupidity. I want a divorce, Destiny. I'm done with you." Destiny staggered backward. "You can't mean that. This is all your fault," Frank continued. "If you hadn't seduced me away from my family, I could have been part of that success instead of the one who crushed it." "Where will I go?" Destiny cried. "I don't have anything." "That's not my problem anymore," Frank said coldly. "You made your bed when you destroyed my family. Now you can lie in it." He turned toward their car, leaving Destiny alone in the parking lot, finally understanding that her greed had cost her everything. 6 months later, Frank sat in his office at Stanford Manufacturing, staring at the same reports he'd been reviewing for the past hour. He still had his job. Barely. His boss, Mr. Richardson, had called him in that Monday morning as promised. "You can thank Andrew Scott for this," Richardson had said coldly. "He specifically asked me not to fire you, said everyone deserves a chance to do better. But let me be clear, Frank, your wife is banned from any and all company events. We don't want drama, and we certainly don't want the kind of embarrassment she caused at the hotel." Frank had nodded numbly, knowing he should feel grateful but feeling only hollow. His coworkers knew now. They all knew what kind of man he really was. The whispers followed him through the halls, the barely concealed looks of disgust and disappointment. He was still area manager, but his respect, what little he'd had, was gone forever. He hadn't divorced Destiny. The threat had been enough to terrify her into submission. She now cooked his meals, cleaned their house, and tried desperately to be the wife she thought he wanted. But Frank still blamed her for everything. The humiliation, the lost respect, his daughter's success that he could never be part of. They fought constantly now, their arguments spilling into public spaces, embarrassing them both. But Frank couldn't see his own role in their destruction. It was easier to blame Destiny than to face the truth, that he had been the one to choose her over his family in the first place. Meanwhile, Violet and Andy's fashion empire kept growing. They launched Andriel Street for men and Sylvain Street for sophisticated women. Dan still had beautiful panic attacks about international orders, and Sylvia still insisted she didn't know anything about fancy fashion. I wake up every morning in Andrew's arms. Surrounded by the family we chose, we built something so beautiful that the past can't touch it. Frank threw away a future fashion mogul for a secretary who couldn't even keep house. Again, sometimes the best revenge really is living well, and we are living very, very well indeed.
If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and drop a comment below. Don't forget to follow for more content just like this. Thanks for watching. Catch you next time.